There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's May 2016, and police have just pulled up in front of a farmhouse north of Adelaide. As they hop out of their vehicle in front of an ordinary brick and tile home in Hillier, 3 men are waiting for them. One of them, the one with 2 obvious black eyes, they soon find out has just murdered 3 people. The bodies of his girlfriend and her 2 young children are inside. The crime scene the officers are about to walk into is horrifying beyond words. But as the crimes of Stephen Graham Peet are unravelled in court, something becomes clear. Those 2 little kids shouldn't have died. Their deaths, at least, were preventable. It was a series of failures from government agencies designed to protect them that actually left them in the path of a killer. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. A warning for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners before we go any further: this podcast contains the names of people who have died. There is also one section in particular, about 5 minutes into this interview you're about to hear, that is extremely graphic. What Pete did to 29-year-old Adeline Yvette Rigney-Wilson, her 6-year-old daughter Amber, and her 5-year-old son Corey is truly unfathomable. We do go into the details in this chat because it's an important part of the story, not only to illustrate the depravity of the crime, but to show you how many failures there were both before and after the murders. Because this isn't just a story about a triple murder that shocked Australia. It starts with a series of failures to protect 2 vulnerable children who were reported to Families SA, the government's child protection arm, dozens of times in the lead up to their deaths. It's also about what happened after. Families of the victims left in the dark by a court system that fails to understand that court processes aren't the only thing that matters. Today's guest followed this story from the very start. Sean Fewster is the senior court reporter for the Advertiser newspaper in Adelaide, and he co-hosts a true crime podcast called Just Lawful with Daniel Pinozzo. He saw firsthand how the court proceedings against Pete destroyed the families left behind by this crime. And as he'll explain, their experience isn't unique. Sean joins us now.
Who was Adeline Yvette Wilson Rigney? And I want to start with her childhood, because she spent a lot of time in the foster system and she kind of bounced around Australia quite a bit.
There are a lot of, I'll put it this way, conflicting stories when it comes to Yvette, as she preferred to be known. Yvette's history is checkered. There are allegations all over the place in terms of abuse. There are people who cared for her very deeply. There are people who hurt her very cruelly. It's hard to get a true sense of the enormity of what she went through. Suffice it to say that hers was not an idyllic childhood, and those who tried to help her found her to be caring, loving, passionate, and highly defensive of her people. Those who crossed her found out that she had a temper, that she had more than an ability to protect herself and more than an ability to protect those that she loved and considered to be her people.
By 2016, she was living near her biological family. What did her life look like then? Was she close to her family? What was her kind of day-to-day?
It's hard for me as a white man to talk about the way that Indigenous families work. I don't have the background and the understanding, but there was definitely connection to her traditional family, definitely connection to her biological family as well. She also had a very strong relationship with her then partner's parents, and that's Steve and Janet, who were very intrinsic in the raising of the 3 children, would offer a lot of respite care, would take the kids for overnight stays, things like that. So she was living in those 2 worlds, if you will, with the traditional family on one side and the more Caucasian Anglo-centric family on the other.
You mentioned mother of three. That's actually something in this story that's not brought up to the public for many, many months into all of this legal process. We're obviously talking about three victims here, Yvette and her two children, but there's a third child in this story. Why didn't we find out about that boy for so long?
Something that South Australia does better than almost anywhere else in the nation is courtroom secrecy. Last year, South Australia had 308 secrecy gags placed by the South Australian courts on all manner of offences, and this is a problem that's dated back 20, 25 years. The courts here take the idea that if there's anything that could possibly, in any way, shape or form, just even maybe slightly perhaps think about upsetting a court case down the track, they're going to bring the banhammer down straight away and suppress it. The courts here are paranoid about social media. They're paranoid even about Wikipedia. They're paranoid about the mainstream media. And so if they can lock things down early, they will. The decision was made very early on to not only suppress the identity of the third child, the eldest child, which would have been a sane way to go to protect the young man from all sorts of enduring trauma and further media attention, but to ban any mention of his existence full stop, so that he was removed from his story. Now, this is a young Indigenous man being removed from his familial lineage and his familial story. He's lost his mother, he's lost his younger brother, he's lost his younger sister, and now when they're spoken about on the news, this young man who was under the age of 10 at the time is looking at the television wondering why he's been erased as well. And when we talk about things like the stolen generation, when we talk about the problems that have happened for Indigenous people in this country, they are perpetuating when supposedly well-meaning judges make a decision like this that has robbed a young man of his agency and his identity in a time when he is greatly traumatised to begin with.
Stephen Graham Peet. Who is he?
In 2016, Stephen Peet was Yvette's on-off boyfriend. There were periods where he would live in the house with Yvette and the three children, the young man that we can't name, Corey and Amber. There were times when he wouldn't live there. There were allegations going in both directions of domestic violence, accusations of assaults. There were times where Yvette reported that Steve had hauled off and hit her. There were times when Steve would claim that Yvette had struck him. Nothing ever went fully through to the courts. There are no records to back up either's assertions. I think the reality is that they were simply very poorly matched for one another, and they weren't the sort of couple that really functioned for a very long period in the same time and place. Pete was not the father of the children. He had his own children who would occasionally come and stay. The relationship was volatile, and it was volatile on both sides.
A warning to listeners, but we're going to get into what happened. Sean, can you tell me what happened to Yvette and her kids in May 2016?
I'm glad you gave the warning to listeners because this is still very difficult for me to say to this day. I've covered a lot of things over a lot of years, 20 plus years doing this, but the day that I heard this in court, quite honestly, I felt like my blood was freezing because you're listening to the story of a man who loses his temper with his on-off partner, takes a vacuum cleaner pipe, beats her to death with it, then hides her body under mattresses so that the two children don't notice what's going on. And when the two children ask, "Where's mummy?" for whatever reason, he decides he's going to kill them as well. And they are killed in the most horrific of ways. They are bound, they are gagged, beset with socks in their mouths that are sticky taped around. They are forced into their bedroom. They are left to choke and suffocate to death with no way of breaking out, with no way of raising help. And cruelly, on top of all this, is that help was not far away because child services workers were knocking on the door either immediately before or immediately after this happened. And to top it all off, again, the abject cruelty of this, Steve and Janet, the children's paternal grandparents, were due to take custody of Corey and Amber that afternoon. There was no need for Pete to do what he did at all, but certainly not when he did it, because those children could have been out of that house 6-7 hours later. They died for nothing. They died for absolutely no reason. And I'm certainly not saying that Yvette deserved to die in any way, shape, or form. But adult versus adult, there's a level that we understand as human beings. We don't agree. We don't condone. We don't accept. We understand. But these two children were completely defenseless. Corey in particular. Corey had speech issues. Corey had learning issues. The likelihood that he understood what was going on in his final moments is near zero. Amber was incredibly intelligent, a wit, just a firecracker of a child from everyone that's ever talked about her. And she would have known. And they both would have fought. And the forensic evidence is there to show that they were trying to kick their way out of the cupboard that they'd been locked in. And it wasn't enough.
I don't think it gets much worse. Murder and torture to this length, involving what you've just described, it's hard to wrap your head around.
To me, it's impossible to wrap my head around. And as I say, I've been doing this 20 plus years. And cruelty is the word I keep coming back to. I'm sorry to be a broken record, but it is cruel. That is the word for it. Yes, it's obviously evil, and I'm sure a lot of people will be going straight to there and saying, well, Sean, Gemma, this is evil. I know it's evil, but evil takes many different forms, unfortunately. The cruelty here of leaving these children to die, even if Pete was a case of, I'm just going to restrain them until I get out of here, until I can dump Yvette's body and then come back and then I'll deal with the kids. You sticky taped the mouths of two children under 10. There is no justification for that. None at all.
Who called the police? How were the bodies found?
Pete came back to the house at one stage and spoke to someone he knew, talked about what was going on, felt like he needed to confess. That person came inside and found Corey and Amber, first of all, walked back outside and knocked Pete unconscious with a single punch. That man and another man who was nearby raised the alarm as a result. And while all this is going on, as I say, child support services have knocked on the door, gotten no answer and left. Steve and Janet are waiting to go pick the children up from school.
You were a court reporter in Adelaide at the time. Do you remember the story breaking?
I do. I remember it because it was in Hillier, and I remember the nearness to where I grew up. And very early on, I got involved because the courtroom where Pete first appeared was at Elizabeth, which is not far from Hillier, but a fair way from Adelaide, so it was a drive. Being the senior of the court reporters and it being a triple murder allegation, I was the one that was tasked to take it on. And I remember sitting in the courtroom until late in the day waiting for the court to release the file to me. While that was happening, members of Yvette's family, from both her side and from the father of the children's side, were turning up to court, and no one was telling them anything. No one was explaining to them what was going on. No one was taking them to one side and saying, I'm the prosecutor, I'm the police officer, anything like that. There was, I'm going to say it, there was a racist response when a large group of Indigenous individuals turned up to a northern suburbs court and said, what the heck's going on? My grandkids, my niece, my nephew have been murdered. Nobody wanted to know. Nobody wanted to talk to them because they were just causing a scene. And so I made a point of sitting down with them and explaining to them what was going on. And they actually invited me back to their house because we were told that court wouldn't be till very late in the day. So we went back to the house and they were giving me photographs of Corey and of Amber and of Yvette and talking about their memories of them because someone had shown them a bit of basic humanity, I guess.
That's such a unique position to be in as a journalist. Usually when you're covering a story like this, when you walk into the courtroom, you know very little details. You might know a few ages, you might have a face, you might be kind of digging on social media, all of which you were already doing behind the scenes, but you had an insight from the family as to who these people were. And you were privy to a lot of things early on. So you knew that there was potential DV, you knew that there was child endangerment, you knew that there was drug use. This was your story. You had basically an exclusive, but you tried to get off this story.
Yeah, in a sense I did. I was concerned that the amount of detail I had meant that anything I reported would screw up the court case coming forward. My secret origin is that I'm actually the son of a police officer. So I have a lot of understanding of just how badly what I do can affect what people like my father did. and how quickly and easily you can completely pervert the course of justice. So I wanted to get off it for that reason, so that there was no potential crossover. But also, I personally have issues with child endangerment cases. I personally have issues with child abuse cases to do with my own background. And there was a very large part of me that was screaming, get off. Don't do this. Don't put yourself through it. But the more that I spoke with Yvette's mother and the more that I spoke later with Steve and Janet, the more I realised that the connection that I had put me in a privileged position where I could cover the case in such a way that I could protect the bona fides of the court process while also keeping these people informed, sometimes of things that I wouldn't even put in the newspaper.
You've mentioned one of the main reasons you didn't want to take the story was that child endangerment space, and it was called Families SA. That was the department at the time. It's now called something different. What do we know about Families SA? What was their involvement with Yvette and her kids?
Yeah, they'd had dozens and dozens of mandatory reports. Those mandatory reports were Tier 1 and Tier 2, which are meant to be acted on within hours. They had not been. The children's school had been informing Families SA of what was going on from their perspective. Families SA did not act. When Families SA did act, it was to do triage, like bringing in a new bed. One of the kids said that they're sleeping on the floor. Oh, well, we'll take Yvette a new bed. How about you look into the systemic issues that are leading to Yvette not having that access, that ability to provide a bed? There were situations where Steve and Janet were looking to take the children for longer periods of respite, and Families SA workers were getting involved in saying, oh, no, we can't separate mother and child. Well, this isn't separation. This is a couple of nights off. No. You have your custody time and that's it. The nexus between the lack of involvement in Families SA in the areas that mattered and the ability for Pete to do what he did, the window that he had in which to operate, is incontrovertible. Families SA are not responsible for the fact that Yvette died. They are responsible for the fact that those two children were still there when Yvette died.
Am I correct in saying the reason that they didn't remove the children earlier was because they didn't want to separate mother and child?
That was one of the excuses they gave, yes. Others were, don't want to get involved, don't want to screw up the family dynamic, there's only a certain amount we can be involved. And we've got to be careful what we say here, because there were family court proceedings and all sorts of other things going on at the time, as there often are surrounding these matters. But suffice it to say that there was a vast gap between what Families SA had its legislative ability to do and what it chose to do.
And by the time we get to 2016 and this story, Families SA had already done this before, numerous times.
Yeah, there was a very infamous case, and one of the reasons I don't cover these sorts of cases anymore, that of Chloe Valentine, a young girl who was allowed to ride a motorcycle until she died. In fact, forced to ride a motorcycle until she died by neglectful parents. And the coroner highlighted there systemic failure after systemic failure after systemic failure. This was still within that same era. In fact, the Families SA people had time to implement the recommendations of the coroner after Chloe Valentine and act upon them long before this happened, and chose not to.
So we're getting a bit of an idea as to why you saw those words and just went, not again.
Yeah. Not again is very, very much the blaring onomatopoeia flashing before my eyes at this time. I did not want to go through this again. And that's selfish, but you've got to look after your own mental health in this game. And I did not want to go through it again. I was convinced otherwise by virtue of the fact that I was in a unique position to tell it, as I say, in a way that could respect the court process while also keeping people involved, because there were so many other people involved in this. You know, we talked at the start of this that there were 3 victims, but there was also a 4th. But there was also a 5th and a 6th and an 8th and a 12th, as those family members get more and more cut off from the system and ask more and more questions about why things aren't being done.
Because I guess what you found in reporting this story is the murder is the start. Then there's all these other kind of, crime might be too strong a word, but wrongdoings that happen while trying to prosecute said crime.
Yeah, failings. In fact, in some ways, the murder is the middle. There are so many systemic failures that lead to the point where the murder can be committed. And none of this takes away Pete's personal responsibility, I want to add. but the environment in which he was able to offend was created by those systemic failures. And then there are systemic failures after the point as well, in terms of the way the court process deals with everybody involved, that lead to outcomes that leave people feeling like they've been poorly served by justice.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with journalist and podcaster Sean Fewster about the Hillier triple murder. Up next, we discuss Stephen Graham Peet's trial and the conviction that saw him sentenced to life in prison.
Let's jump to Peet's trial. It gets underway more than a year after he's arrested and charged with a triple murder, and he pleads guilty to murdering Yvette and not the children.
Yeah.
You were there in court. Was that a shock?
Shock is a good word. It might be a little too high. I think I was surprised because experience told me I know where we're going next. I had an inkling of what he was trying to do by making this claim. Unfortunately, we've had triple murders here in South Australia before. The Kapunda triple murder is another very famous one. And what you see are either defendants or very clever defence counsel saying, well, the first one was a murder. But after that, some kind of fugue state, some kind of mental snap came in. And so the other two murders are the result of mental illness, not personally responsible for those. So that's manslaughter rather than murder. And the minute that Peet said guilty to Yvette and not guilty to the two children, I thought, again, not again. Here we go again. We are playing by the same playbook. We talk a lot on our show about the banality of evil, the fact that every act of evil is unique, but the garbage that surrounds it is the same structures, the same attempts, the same script.
Let's get more into Peet in a minute, but during those opening statements, that description you gave us earlier of what happened to Yvette and her children, that horrific description, that was the first time the family of those people heard what had happened. How did that happen?
Because our Director of Public Prosecutions, and I don't mean the individual, I mean the office of the DPP in South Australia has a remit to ensure the fair trial of a defendant. They do not in anywhere in their charter have the remit to look after the well-being of victims of crime. And so if they believe that the best way to guarantee the fairness of the process for the defendant is to keep the victim's family in the dark, they'll do it. And they do it. Again, we're going to go back to Kapunda. The first time that the families in the Kapunda triple murder heard how their loved ones died was in court with no warning. This is not new. This is, again, something that the DPP in South Australia does time and time again. I've never understood the lack of empathy. I've never understood the lack of consideration. And sometimes I feel like prosecutors in this state look at victims and say, well, you're a bother. You don't fit in my nice little boxes of how to clinically and forensically run a trial. You're messy. So I'll leave the mess to one side and you can just hear about it in court like everybody else.
But like you say, it's just a blatant lack of empathy. These people have lost the people closest to them. They've spent a year waiting for this court date. They turn up and all they know is that this man allegedly murdered their loved one, and then they sit there and they hear what you just described. That's horrifying.
Horrifying is a perfect word. Anybody that's ever had anxiety knows that the worst thing is sitting there at night thinking about what it might be. But I can tell you the thing that's worse is finding out what it was without any warning and finding out in public. The courtrooms in South Australia are old wood-panelled buildings and the seats are L-shaped. They are not very comfortable at all and they're benches. I'm sitting in a bench and as these words are said, as that description is given, I hear a howl behind me. And it's the family. Because of course it's the family. The way you reacted, the way the listeners are reacting now, that's horrifying for us. But we didn't know those children. We didn't hold those children the moment they were born. We didn't raise those children, watch them run around. In Yvette's case, we didn't love her, spend time with her, watch her grow up into a woman. And this is how you find out the manner of their death? It's obnoxiously appalling.
I know we're talking about South Australia here, but is this a court process that happens all over Australia?
I'm not fully aware of it, but I will tell you this much. The more privileged that a victim of crime's family is, and the higher up the socioeconomic strata they are, the less likely this is to happen.
What was Stephen's story?
His excuse was that Yvette came at him with the vacuum cleaner pipe. He acted in self-defence, that he pushed it too far, that he knew he'd pushed it too far, therefore he was guilty of her murder. But everything that happened after that, he didn't properly remember. He had a psychological snap, it was a fugue state, no memory.
And the defence was able to take that one step further, right? They basically kind of halted the trial.
They did, that's right. They wanted it sent away for further psychological testing to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond reasonable doubt, that he was an automaton at the time. They needed someone to sign off on that, some mental health expert to say, yes, this is all legit and above board, and therefore we need to move into a different kind of sentencing, taking mental health into account rather than simple criminality and criminal liability.
So the family, they've waited more than a year. They're sitting there in court. They hear these horrible things, and then suddenly it's all over.
Yeah.
You walk out.
And you don't understand why. Because the explanation I've just given to you then is longer than the explanation was given in court. The explanation in court was, Your Honour, we need to explore Section 269 issues to do with automatonism, and we need an adjournment in order to engage the services of mental health professionals. Right, says the judge, I'll give you this date, court adjourned. If you don't speak the jargon, you don't understand what that means, you're left looking at your hands going, what just happened? And what does it mean?
So who explains it to them?
I did. Now, I've got to give great props here to the Victims' Rights Commissioner in South Australia, Sarah Quick. Phenomenal human being who does her utmost to be at court, to send staff to court, to involve victims and let them know what's going on. Sarah wasn't the Victims' Rights Commissioner at this point. What Sarah does now is laudable and an outgrowth of this era. And at that point, there's nobody to explain this but me.
Which is unbelievable. A journalist informing a victim's family about the court process.
I wish I could tell you it was the first time I'd done it, and I wish I could tell you it's the last time I've done it since. But it's not in either case.
Because court is so confusing. I used to be a court reporter on the road. Now I just do it from the comfort of my studio / my desk. But courtrooms are really overwhelming. There is a lot of jargon. It's a bit of a cold environment as well. People are there to do their job. They're not there to deal with victims and families and people in the public. And you kind of sit there and go, oh, I don't know what's going on.
There's no thought for the victims' families. There's another case that I covered where a piece of CCTV footage had to be played showing a young man's death in a coward punch incident. That piece of footage was played 55 times in court. Forwards, backwards, frame by frame, slow motion, can I see that again, etc. Nobody stopped to warn the young man's mother that this was going to happen. And so by Revolution 7, she couldn't move because she was near catatonic. Just a 2-minute break to say, we're going to play this footage, anyone that doesn't want to see it, please step out of court now, is all that needs to happen. But no, the forensic pursuit of the proper administration of justice must come above all things, including humanity.
Or even the story we're currently talking about, pulling the family aside before court, allowing them to process what happened in a room without everyone watching them. Just simple kind of steps.
And you can imagine why the relationship between Steve and Janet in particular and the DPP became fractious. Because their needs were not being serviced by the way the DPP was choosing to handle the case. Now, if the DPP wants to handle the case that way, that's their choice. I can't do anything about that. But when the victim's family is saying, you are leaving us out of this process, you are blindsiding us constantly, you are not involving us, you're not letting us know what's going on, surely you've got to stop and say, well, there's got to be more I can do there. Or even, I'll call in the Victims' Rights Commissioner, or I'll call in a victim support service or some kind of agency. If I don't want to tackle that personally as a prosecutor, I'll at least put you in touch with who will help you. But no, I'm going to leave you to the journalist. The sorts of things that I could have reported about this case in terms of stuff the court process, I'm just going to report what's happening, would have been ridiculously sensational. And I don't mean that in the negative sense of sensationalistic. I mean people would have been sensationalized and scandalized by them. But you can't do that. You've got to put a gag on yourself because at the end of the day, there are still, in this case, at the point we're at right now, 2 children's alleged murders that need to be dealt with.
When Peet's trial eventually does get underway again, what are the bombshells that he drops as they re-enter the court after waiting another 6 months for it to go ahead?
The bombshell is now that he's ready to plead guilty to everything. Obviously, the interviews with the psychologist didn't go the way that he was planning. Perhaps the psychologist wasn't quite prepared to sign off on automatonism in the way that he was hoping.
So that means that the families are spared a trial that basically picks apart everything that happened. And what you mentioned before, things like the going over a video over and over again, they're spared that. We skip straight to sentencing and victim impact statements. How did that go?
To a point, it seemed to be all right, but it really wasn't, because at that stage in South Australia, the law said that a defendant could have a victim's impact statement edited if they felt they were offended by it or it scandalised them. The Defence Counsel could also object to it. The DPP could object to it, and even the judge could object to it. So rather than speaking their truths, what Janet said and what Yvette's mother said were incredibly edited statements.
You think that the point of a victim impact statement is that you get to say what you want. I've worked in court for a while and I didn't realise that they were edited.
They are, because they're supposed to only be about the financial, emotional, and health impact upon you of the crime. So lawyers will argue, defence lawyers will argue, well, calling someone a monster isn't part of the impact. Criticising someone's decision to murder your loved ones isn't an impact. You need to stick to, I've lost this much money, or I've missed this many days of work, or I've had to speak to this many doctors. Again, that forensic, keeping things neatly in a box, no messy stuff.
What about Steve? He had a very unique experience there.
Steve and the prosecutor had a falling out because the prosecutor would not shift, and nor would Steve. He decided, if I don't get to say my victim impact statement the way that I want to, then I'm not going to give it. It's not worth it. It's not worth my time, because you are continually cutting us out of the process, and now you're cutting up my part of the process.
And it takes people like that fighting back to kind of change the system, and most victims' families are too distraught, really.
And they don't have the access. Who do you go to? Let's call it like it is. Gawler, Hillier, Elizabeth are all low socioeconomic areas. I grew up in the only good house on a bad street because my father was the local copper. If you're Steve, if you're Janet, if you're Yvette's mum, you don't have access to speak to power. You don't have a way of reaching these people. The lady who had to watch the video again and again and again of her son dying, she's from Whyalla, out the back of Donga. These people don't have anyone or any way to reach into Parliament and say, this is wrong.
Before the sentence was handed down, the psychological report that we mentioned before that Peet tried to use and that didn't work to kind of get out of some of those guilty pleas, that was released eventually. What did it reveal?
Part of what struck me the most is that we said at the top of this broadcast there was no need for the children to die. Peet knew they were leaving, and he admitted in the psychological report his original plan was he was going to kill Yvette the next day after the children left. So they would have survived. We wouldn't have been here. Yvette tragically was going to die no matter what, because he had made his mind up that he was going to kill her. But he couldn't wait for whatever reason, whether there was an incident between the two of them, whether there was a flare-up, whether he decided that there was a flare-up. This is not a situation where she might have necessarily prompted her murder. He might have just decided, I'm sick of you speaking to me that way, here comes the iron bar. The cruelty again of, I can't wait to kill you, so I'm just going to do it here and now. And then the other thing that comes from the report is he was in such a fit of pique that had the family's SA door knockers interrupted him, he would have been prepared to kill them as well. And here's the tragic thing about that. Had two families' SA workers been murdered on the job, there would have been a lot of legislative change a lot faster.
So in sentencing, when that eventually gets underway, he gets life in prison with an on-parole period of 30 years. What was your reaction to that? What was the family's reaction to that?
My reaction was, how can this possibly be less than the Kapunda triple murders?
Because that was 35, right?
That was 35. And in that case, you had 2 adult victims and 1 teenage victim. Now, I'm not going to argue the value of a life here, but can you honestly tell me that cutting off the lives of 2 children under 10 isn't worth more than that. But no, we're going to cut it off at 30.
Did the judge give a reason?
Let's put it this way, not to my satisfaction. Not a reason that would stick in my head and make me think, I see the mathematics here. Daniel and I often talk about courtroom mathematics, and it's his least favourite subject. How you weigh up a life, how you do these calculations, because they don't survive scrutiny. I don't remember any major moments here where I could even point to and say, well, there's the scrutiny right there. It was just 3 deaths, 30 years. And of course, we've got to remember every time that that's a non-parole period. Doesn't mean you are going to be released. You could still end up doing a life sentence, etc., but that's no comfort and no condign punishment. Something that upsets me is when politicians and judges say publicly, no sentence will ever satisfy a victim's family. It's not true. If Steve and Janet and Yvette's mum got told Kapunda triple murder was 35 years, Hillier triple murder is 35 years, they'd go, okay, we wish it was longer, but we understand that that's what the sentence for a triple murder is. By going so much lower, they added to the burden of these families.
It was actually eventually readjusted to 36 years. How did that happen?
Someone in the DPP realised perhaps we should do something. Too little, too late, but finally we should do something. Now, at this point, I need to point out that part of the reason the DPP acted was because Steve went public. Steve broke his silence and talked about the way they'd been treated, talked about the sentencing process, talked about the editing of the victim impact statements, talked about everything. And the DPP was suddenly in a position publicly where all eyes were on them. You have failed this family in this family's estimation for so long. What are you going to do about it now the sentence is so low? And the Court of Appeal agreed that, yes, the sentence needed to go up. It needed to be increased, that it was not an effective and efficient and even appropriate recognition and reckoning with the criminality. And Peet's own lawyers agreed. Peet's own lawyers, and from my information, Peet himself agreed that he needed to serve more time.
Hang on, is that the first morsel of remorse we've seen?
Yes, very much so. I'll put it this way. I don't think it's too far a jump to assume that Peet is remorseful for killing Corey and Amber. I don't think Peet's capable of feeling remorse for killing Yvette. And I don't think he's capable of understanding the enormity of what he's done. So I believe that when his lawyers came to him and said, they're trying to get your sentence up, he probably went, okay, let it go. Don't fight it. And maybe that's the first spark of offender recognition. Maybe it's because he was bashed in prison repeatedly by people that knew Yvette. Who knows?
In 2019, there was another court case. Steve and Janet, they were fighting the suppression order that we've mentioned before, the third boy, Yvette's eldest son. Why? Why were they doing that?
Every time the story was talked about, be it in court or be it in the coroner's inquest, the young man was becoming more and more distressed. He wasn't even pixelated at that point. He was cut out of photographs. There's a very famous photograph of Corey and Amber that got used. It's one of the ones they gave me on the very first day when I met the family. And he's cut out of it. Has to be. Because the court had ruled that this suppression was so important that we couldn't even pixelate the young man. He had to be removed from existence. The psychological harm that was doing him was feared to be irreparable unless something was done. And so Steve and Janet had to petition the courts to get those suppression orders overturned. And there were two of them. There was one in the Magistrates Court, where he'd first appeared, and one in the Supreme Court, where it had been backed up. So you have these two people from the northern suburbs with no lawyers and no legal training trying to argue that these suppressions should be lifted against judges and the DPP who are saying it's actually in the best interest of the child if this stays in place. Steve and Janet are a case of we're raising the child. We're seeing him day after day after day. We know what his life is like. We will tell you what his best interests are. No, says the judge. No, says the DPP. We understand the best interests of the child. This suppression should stay in place.
So once again, it's just that disconnect, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, fortunately, under the laws of suppression order in South Australia, the media has a right to stand up and argue. So we stood up and argued, and myself and other members of the media stood up and argued on behalf of Steve and Janet, saying we supported their position. We wanted to be able to show the photo of the family together with the boy's face pixelated. We didn't want to name him. We didn't want to identify him. We wanted to return him to the story and let him be part of his family again. And fortunately, the judge saw the wisdom in that and said, that sounds like a good halfway measure. We'll go with that.
And is the boy in question happy with that?
Yeah. I'm very fortunate that I've come to know Steve and Janet and their family very well through all of this. I have regular contact with them, and he's doing brilliantly. There is a lot of heartache there. There is a lot of trauma there. He misses his mother and he misses his siblings so badly. But at the same time, he's thriving in so many ways. He's a young man now who's nearly finished high school. He's excelling in sports. He's doing well in his studies. But he'll sit there at times and he'll look and he'll say, you know, Amber would be in year 10 by now, or Corey would just be joining me in high school now. And those are losses he'll never get over. But by the very same token, he's able to look back at all of the coverage that's been done and now see his face in it. And it's quite good, actually. He'll look at the pixelated face of himself and he'll grin and he'll say, I guess I'm just too cool to be in the newspaper. So at least he's able to find a way to cope with some humour.
For a young man that's gone through so much tragedy to come up with that kind of wit.
He's an incredible young man.
I'm scared to ask this, but have we seen any improvements? And there's a few kind of places to direct that question. Firstly, the courts. We've kind of touched on numerous ways that they let these families down and that they've previously let other families down in the same way. Has anything changed there?
At the moment, no. I'm hoping for change coming. The current Attorney General listened to everything that was being said about victim impact statements, has drafted new legislation to ban the editing of victim impact statements, which is a good start. At time of listening to this, that legislation comes into effect soon. There is also a peak study being conducted by the University of South Australia on the overuse of suppression orders in South Australia. The Attorney General said to me as recently as 2 weeks prior to this recording that he's waiting on the outcome of that before looking at new legislation to reel that back in. And as I said, 308 suppression orders last year, 2023. That's just 20 shy of the record of 328 from the year 2000 when the infamous bodies in the barrels case happened. So there's room for change there. The courts themselves won't change. It will be the legislation that governs them that they must follow that will lead to them changing. We've had a change of leadership at the DPP. The jury's out on that at the moment because it came out in an independent report that the DPP was operating like the Hunger Games, with people stressed out of their minds and overworked, underpaid, overstressed. Whether or not the current DPP can get a wrangle on that and also stop giving thought bubbles for reform, as the report called it, and actually implement reform, I think will dictate and determine whether their relationships with victims improve. As I said, we have a new Victims' Rights Commissioner, Sarah Quick. The change in that office has been night and day. It's phenomenal to see how engaged she is, how involved she is, and how on the front foot she is. Sarah worked as the 2IC of that office for many years. And I think this is very much the case of someone going, finally, I can do it my way.
The one that really sticks with me is the families finding out in court what happened.
Yeah.
Does that mean we're on the way to changing that? Is Sarah helping there?
Sarah is definitely advocating for change in that space, and the Attorney General is listening. Kaya Ma is our Attorney General here at the moment, and for whatever you do and don't think about Labor versus Liberal and the politics in this country, he's clearly a man who cares and clearly a man who is prepared to listen and consider change. And I think this case in particular sticks with him. He is an Indigenous man himself. And I think part of that crossover, that Venn diagram, makes him look and say, this could be so much better for everybody.
What about Families SA, now called the Department of Child Protection?
Oh, there's a loaded question. I don't handle a lot of Families SA/DCP stuff myself. I only handle it when it comes to court, and I have colleagues who spend a lot of their time reporting about them. There is a new chief executive. From all reports, including Steve and Janet themselves, she has an open ear, she has an empathetic heart, and a drive for reform. The woman who sat in the seat before her throughout the coronial inquest into this case swore black and blue that nothing was wrong, that they did nothing wrong, that everything was above board and fine. Now, she's no longer there. So I guess the kindest thing I can say is that it's too early to call when it comes to DCP.
I guess that's a good point to make, though, because when you try and make change in organisations and systems that are this big, it unfortunately doesn't happen overnight. It can take years. It can take decades sometimes.
Absolutely. I look at the laws that I've been privileged to be involved in changing, and we're always talking 15, 18 years of campaigning. It's very slow going, but it's inevitably worth it. The problem is whether it gets rolled back by a new regime, a new chief executive, by a high court decision. That's what you've always got to watch out for.
What do you want people to take away from listening to this story and the details around it? Because we often don't go this deeply into everything that might surround a crime because we don't have someone like you that was there watching it all unfold. So this is a really unique position to be in. What do you want people to take away from being able to lift the lid and actually look in underneath?
I'd like your listeners to remember that every single case they ever read about is just like this. There's nothing unique and special about the wide-ranging fallout of this. It might fall out differently through different avenues, through different venues. It might be a large family, small family. It may not have government involvement. It may have social club involvement. There are all sorts of ways that these things ripple out. But every single case is like this. So when you listen to any form of true crime podcast or consume any form of court-related media, be it myself, be it any other writer, be it a book, be it Netflix, remember that there are real people who are getting impacted by this again and again and again. And re-victimization is very real. So exercise empathy when you listen to these things and realize that so many other people that you'll never meet are being impacted and affected by invisible systems and processes that are broken or just don't work as well as they should or simply don't care about the little people. Because that's the thing that adds to the trauma of the horror of the crime. They say it's not the incident that destroys you, it's the court case. And this is why.
Thanks to Sean for assisting us to tell this story. His podcast, Just Lawful, did a 9-part series on this case. So if you'd like to hear more in-depth discussion about the Hillier triple murder, you can find that linked in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Moylan. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation.